Hello and welcome to the Dissidents Podcast, where we talk about how we can strive for a world where freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. This week, as we join Lee Jussim at USC for the Conference on Censorship in the Sciences, we are revisiting our live stream with Lee and Catherine Salmon on the ethics of institutional review boards and the role they play in censorship and the decline of academic freedoms. All right, we are live. Welcome everyone to our November Liberalism in Practice, panel discussion. This one is unethical, unconventional, or unpleasant, the role of ethical review boards. And with us today, we have Lee Jussim, professor of psychology at Rutgers, and Catherine Salmon, professor of psychology at the University of Redlands. And we invited them specifically because Lee, on your Substack, Unsafe Science, your two pieces, one that you co-wrote with one of your students, IRB 2.0, Weaponizing IRB 2.0. And the first one, though, was written by Catherine Salmon with us, and it was how the IRB can be weaponized. And that piqued a lot of interest with our ILB fellows who are also joining us here, Pam Hayes-Bohannon and Elizabeth Spivak, both who are Elizabeth, who is a professor of psychology as well at Bridgewater State University, and Pam, who is a librarian at Bridgewater State University, or is deciding still somewhat retired. But both of Elizabeth and Pam have served on IRBs before and found these two ideas and these two pieces that you and Catherine wrote on how the IRB can be weaponized really fascinating. So thank you for joining us today. For our audience who are watching, you can join in the conversation. We invite you to join in the conversation. You can do so by leaving comments either on ILVs, which is at IL Values, Twitter, and they'll show up on over here, or on ILV's YouTube page if you're watching it live. So please do join in the conversation, and we will get to our audience questions too. As we get started, before we really get into the meat of this, a lot of people don't know what an institutional review board, I've been saying IRB, my apologies for not spelling it out to begin with, an institutional review board is. This is something that if you're not in academia, you might not have come across. However, the implications of what's going on with IRBs is something that is mirroring a lot of societal trends. So with that said, I'd like to start, Elizabeth, with you. If you can just give us an idea of what an IRB is, how it works, its purpose, do you have to apply to an IRB? These kind of questions that would give our audience kind of a general idea of what exactly we're talking about.
Yeah, so IRBs are supposed to be independent of either the universities or the hospitals where they operate. And their power really is based on a government code of federal regulations, Title 45, Part 46. One member must have a primary concern that's non-scientific, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, and one has to be scientific, but not necessarily scientific in the way specialized in whatever the application is. So you have to have a scientist and a non-scientist on the board, but they don't have to have any specialty in what they're reviewing, which is, we can talk about. So the sort of simultaneously very elaborate and detailed nature of Title 45, Part 46, and the really vagueness of what is called the common rule is part of what is causing this sort of push-pull and what sometimes might be considered difficulty that people have. Their primary concern is with human subjects and what constitutes justifiable or unjustifiable harm. Most survey collections, interviews, even re-examinations of previously collected data are expected to apply for IRB approval. Many IRBs have shifted, though, from protecting human subjects to instead sort of shielding their agency. So they become sort of part of their governing, their organization's sort of governing body to protect them. And I don't know to what extent that's an IRB wanting to do that, and what and whether that's the organizations, the hospitals, the universities. Government backing of IRBs has made them the conventional method of ensuring human subjects' safety. And if people don't get approval, it leaves the institution potentially up to liability if a researcher violates from a protocol. Many journals require IRB approval, like a letter or confirmation of IRB approval. So we have multiple organizations that are sort of pushing against researchers, whether they would, maybe they would not want to apply, but they have to in order maybe to get published, or because their institution requires it. Some studies have found that up to 80% of proposals are not approved as submitted. That's causing a lot of angst. A number of IRBs have suspended or completely rejected, research proposals. And, this suggests that, it's going to make researchers annoyed and angry, right? when things get delayed. So, so that's basically what an IRB is the entity that's sort of, in theory, protecting the organization from liability. So its duty is to protect human subjects from unjustifiable harm.
So just let me to be clear, as again, someone who's not in academia. So if you are going to do any kind of study, whether it's a study that you're going to publish or a study for a dissertation that includes human subjects, you are required to go through an IRB.
Yeah, and there are actually categories that are considered exempt. Okay, however, most granting organizations, most even publications, and even internally in your organization, whether it's a university or hospital, often still requires an exemption letter. So even though your research, according to the common rule, would be exempt from IRB review, there's this requirement to have the letter that rules you exempt. So again, that's not necessarily what the IRB wanted to do. In fact, the new common rule was designed so that people who knew their research was exempt wouldn't have to go through the process. And that's not what has happened.
And how would you be exempt? I mean, do you get this?
Something that is not, that is, sort of like a survey you would take in the mall. An adult who would be participating of their own, volition in something that would be not, again, not considered harmful, it would need to be something that they would encounter in their everyday life. So if you would encounter foul language in your everyday life, then you should likely be able to, as an adult, look at a survey that includes foul language, for example. So you should be able to, see a swear word or something, even something mildly, transiently offensive would be something that you would encounter in your everyday life. If you turned on the radio or the television any hour of the day and any day of the week, you might encounter something that was transiently offensive, or that you didn't, that you considered, upsetting. That should still be exempt.
I'll say it goes even farther than that. I'll give an example about myself. I submitted an article to a journal in which I was just describing a project I undertook with a student in the library where I work. And the student, got some academic credit for it. And it was really just to say, librarians can mentor students too. That was really the purpose of the article. And one of the reviewers, when I submitted it to the journal, was like, "Did you get IRB approval on this?" And what? It wasn't a study. It was just a description of something that happened. And but I think this person was just like, oh, you have to get IRB approval for everything, and so I was like, I went to Elizabeth and I said, what? Like, should I have gone through the IRB for this? And she said, no, just tell them it's exempt, because it was exempt. It wasn't even something that needed, but it is happening. I've been noticing this in the literature. Like, it says, like, journals won't publish if you don't prove that you have IRB approval, even if it's something that apparently, like, this didn't involve student subjects. It's beyond my own student. Like, if I described what happened in a regular classroom, oh, here's something I tried and it worked really well. Like, would that require IRB approval? No.
Oh, you're muted, Jen.
What I'm hearing then is, sorry, by the way, I'm putting myself on mute because I think there is still a little reverb on one of our ends. So I know we'll have to remember to unmute and mute ourselves, but muting ourselves might help with that. So what you were saying with exempt, Pam, I think that just kind of plays in with what Elizabeth said, and I want to reiterate just to make sure that, to clarify. So even if your project is exempt, the IRB has to look at it to tell you you are exempt, right?
Yeah, not according to the IRB, but according to many other entities. They're asking for this a letter of exemption. So the IRB, again, the common rule was redesigned with great, fanfare, so that wouldn't happen. But it didn't help. If anything, it made it worse, I think.
Catherine or Lee, you want to jump in on the IRB?
Yeah, let me just briefly. I think I can keep this. I think I can keep this brief. This whole discussion so far is a testament to the bureaucratic insanity that is the IRB. I mean, there was originally a real purpose, which is, you had doctors abusing patients, you had people, scientists putting people in very anxiety, arousing or threatening situations without their consent, and those were abuses that you needed to be monitored and prevented, and so the origins of the IRB, which in the late 60s or early 70s, I think, I'm not completely sure, they had a very clear and very limited mandate to ensure the protection of human and animal participants from those kinds of abuses. I support that. I think my guess is everybody here supports that. But this kind of stuff that Elizabeth, most of what Catherine and I do, for example, is ask people questions. There's no matter how offensive the question, it's just a question. And part of every study says, one, you don't have to participate in the study if you don't want to. And if you do, you don't have to answer any particular question you don't want to answer. That's it. We're all consenting adults. The IRB really needs to go fuck itself at this point.
Well, but the problem is not the IRB, because the IRB, I mean, I was an IRB chair for, over 10 years, and the IRB is overworked, and, there's backlogs. It's, we get tons of questions that need to be answered, and we handhold, people a lot. But it really is the organization that is saying, the organizations that we work for that are requiring this. I think most IRBs would like to be doing less of this and, doing more real work. And now we have central IRBs and, combined, like, think about how global research is now, right? Like this is complicated to consider, local and, international human protections laws and rules and everything. And so IRBs would rather be focusing on that kind of thing, but it seems like we can't really get out of that.
Yeah, that's a fair point, and that is that all this nonsense is coming from the top. It's not coming necessarily from the people in the IRB. Yeah, that's a completely fair point.
Well, let me ask again for clarity, as someone not in academia. Elizabeth, you said, coming from the higher, from the top, from the people who are invested in the IRB. Who are those people? Who is at the top?
So in our case, for Pam and myself, it was, administration. And when they didn't like a study that was approved because somebody complained about it, they actually threatened to put administrators on the IRB. So we were, to essentially keep us from being the independent board that we were, that we're supposed to be. So yeah, I think there is a lot of pressure, and certainly I got, hate emails from, outside the organization, other IRB members emailed me to say, how could your IRB approve this study with an offensive question on it? So there are certainly IRB members, chairs or members that also feel, are also, overreaching. But our experience, and I think in most hospitals, my students who now have gotten jobs in hospitals and stuff are finding that it's really hospital administration, it's university administration that's putting most of the pressure on.
So
and journal.
I'm going to go a little bit off script here, but Catherine, in your piece that you wrote on weaponizing the IRB, you name actually like 3 different ways that the IRB has been weaponized. One of them is the administration using it as its own kind of tool, as reputational. Do you want to just kind of run through some of the ways that you've seen the IRB weaponized?
Sure. I think administration, and that's partially what was being alluded to, right? With administration not liking a particular research study, putting pressure on the board, appointing people on the board who will follow a particular agenda. Those are certainly ways that the administration can try to discourage it. There was one study that I talked about that, the researcher was doing research on students who are engaging in sex work to actually pay their student bills and their tuition. And the university, while acknowledging that this was a useful topic, and of course it had been published, were trying to discourage him from doing that research with their students because they really didn't want people to understand that they had students who couldn't pay their bills and so were either working as exotic dancers or as prostitutes. And so they felt that it was damaging the university's reputation, right? So we're exerting pressure for that reason on it. And that's certainly one way in which they can do that. They can also, make people jump through hoops many, many, many times. And for students, that's prohibitive, right? If they don't get their work done on time, they're not going to actually get their degree done. And so if you don't like, the research agenda a student has, you can shut it down and really make it so that kind of research isn't going to happen. So there's a variety of different ways in which the administration, and also sometimes even jealous colleagues who happen to be on IRBs, or people who are on an IRB who have a particular ideological agenda and are opposed to the particular research projects that people undertake. An example of that, I had a colleague at an East Coast university who was trying to replicate and extend some research that I had already published that had to do with people's perceptions of sexually explicit images. And he was using eye tracker technology, or at least that's what he wanted to do, to actually see what people were looking at when they were looking at the images, as opposed to having people just rating the images, which was what we had done. And so this is something that had been done multiple times before. It had been published. It had gone through an IRB process at our university. There had been no adverse effects. It would be shocking to imagine that college students who view this stuff on their own would be bothered by viewing it for free as part of a study. But his IRB said no, because the chair, who was a brand new chair with no experience in social psych research, was uncomfortable when they saw the images and thought that everybody else would be, and so shut the study down. That seems inappropriate.
Yeah, and to be clear, again, discomfort is not, that's not something that the IRB should be rejecting a study for, because someone will be uncomfortable.
Right.
Yeah.
And the reality is that, the students probably would not have been uncomfortable with the images because nobody had reported any concerns in our study. It was done with college students too.
Yeah, but even if they were,
Right.
It would not be a reason to, reject a study. And over again, the research shows that, even people who have been suicidal, who then respond to surveys and are asked about suicidality, do not, their level of suicidal thoughts or, plans, or nothing changes. So even people who have been suicidal, have been hospitalized for suicidality, don't don't increase the thoughts or the likelihood of another suicidal incident after answering questions about suicide. That would be probably the most extreme, idea that one of the most extreme, sort of offenses. And they're just simply answering, as Lee said, answering a survey question just has not been found to be traumatic, to the extent that it requires human subjects.
Right. Well, there's something, incredibly paternalistic
about. Get the word out of my mouth. Paternalistic. Yeah. Yeah.
We need to protect them from things that they don't need to be protected from.
Mm-hmm. And Lee you mentioned in your piece, weaponizing the IRB 2.0, how these things like offense. I mean, they're kind of frivolous charges, and that's, Elizabeth kind of touched on this. It's like, a normal person isn't going to be offended by this, and there's no review of the IRB's review. And that brings me to my other question that I really want everyone to answer is, on what ethics does the IRB judge itself?
I mean, there's two answers. It doesn't, and whatever the administrator, the top administrator that oversees it wants. That's it. Those are the two answers.
Well, I think Pam and I would disagree with that. We were quite, we certainly spent a fair amount of time considering our own ethical.
I would disagree. I was the non-scientist on our board, and I'll say this: I did catch a lot of things that nobody else on the board noticed, because I didn't understand scientific method, so I wasn't looking at that, and I did see things like, oh, this question doesn't even make sense, or that nobody else caught, right? So, but ultimately, I took my role as protecting human subjects seriously. That's what I was looking. That was how I saw my role, and that was the most important thing I thought when I was on the board. And and it didn't mean that, I don't know, one of these questions says do no harm. That was not what we were looking for. Will this do no harm, right? That's not possible, right? Is the harm, is it something we can live with, right? Somebody's offended or embarrassed, or, does that outweigh what we might learn from this study? And so I did point out, if we had the researcher there, we had a question, I might say, why do you have, why is this part of the study, and you're saying here that there's absolutely no risk at all, where I can see a risk. It's a small one, but that's different than no risk. And I would, and ultimately, maybe all it had to do was, put in the introduction, here's the risk. It's really small, but be aware of it, right? And like you said, Lee, there's always an out. We're adults, right? If we don't want to finish the study, we don't finish the study. Nobody can make you.
Well, so I'm gonna, the question that Jennifer posed was on what ethics does an IRB judge itself, and I think both of you, Pam and Elizabeth, the abstract gist of your answer has been on whatever the ethics of the individuals comprising it constitute, and that is a recipe for pandemonium. This is because people are going to be different, and they're going to have different ethical standards, and they're going to have different views as to what constitutes harm and risk, and so it really creates a capricious, a high potential for a capricious environment in making IRB decisions. So I accept that that's true, I interpreted the question to mean, are there any sort of external or neutral or overarching ethical standards by which the IRB judges itself? And I'm not aware of any. And that it really comes down to, are you, as Elizabeth and Pam pointed out, it's either your personal and perhaps somewhat subjective and idiosyncratic ones, and, have you, if not exactly satisfied your administrative master, have you at least not excessively found yourself in their crosshairs?
Yeah, and let's just be clear, Pam and I resigned from the board. So, I mean, like when the shit hit the fan at our university, all the members resigned. So,
what hit the fan? What is that story? That sounds like an interesting story.
Tell it.
So we had one of my own students. So I can't review my own research. Of course, I'm the chair, but so I couldn't review my own exempt research. And so a different board member did, and then someone else higher up, an administrator, actually signed my letter that said my study was approved. Just like Catherine said, this is research that had been published in the a research paradigm that we'd used for many years and had been published by others as well. It was a replication and extension. We asked, we were using Boroditsky and Thibodeau's little sentence about crime, and we were using it for Black Lives Matter and COVID-19, which is that it's either a wild beast or it's an open wound. Okay, and so of course, Black Lives Matter being a wild beast was offensive to someone. And on a Monday morning at 7:00 in the morning, I got a phone call from my department chair, and I've never done any research at my university ever again. My students got death threats. We were called white supremacists and lots of other things. The university president actually apologized for us multiple times in all campus, all alumni, all donor email letters. But what happened, I served out my term, and so did Pam. And then the others, when my term was up, they did not actually remove us from the board, although there were some touch and go moments there, weren't there, Pam? Touch and go moments. When I don't think they realized they were going to shut down the IRB entirely. And I called up the administrator and said, you realize that if you shut down the IRB, we're out of compliance, and that shuts down all funding. Like, you realize this, right? Like, they shut down, they cut off the money and ask questions later. Like, that's the deal here, right? So if we don't have an IRB, then, we're not in compliance. And so we did not shut down, and I served out the remainder of my term, and and then we all resigned. And there is no internal. There are IRB members, but there is no internal review right now. They send it out, so there is no. They never replaced the board at all. There are other IRBs that other people do contentious research, and their IRBs stand up for themselves, the researchers. Seton Hall, some people we've had on the podcast have, they've done some, research that was quite, offensive, if you will, about grade inflation. And it offended a lot of people. They got a lot of complaints, and the IRB at Seton Hall said, hey, there's nothing wrong with this research. So I know that and I think that I guess I would say that we tried very hard to stick to the letter of the common rule and stay out of things that were none of our business. But we also did feel like any use of participants' time for research that was maybe legally kind of, gray area, we should at least ask the researcher to do, to come back to us with more justification, or any research that, because that's a cost. If you can't find anything if this research is so poorly designed that you're not going to be able to find anything, we did ask them to do a revision. Now, we were a small shop, so that didn't take very long. It didn't take months. Where you are, it might take months, right? To, you're talking about delays that go on and on and on. But you're right. There is nothing within within the common rule. There is no, sort of internal ethics. Like here are the ethics that IRB members must follow. I think the assumption is that that you're on a board that is called the ethical, that's essentially its charge is ethical review, that you will engage in that work, with purity of heart. And I think that we tried very hard to do that. But IRB is different, and you're right. That's why we get different kinds of outcomes at different institutions, and that shouldn't happen.
Yeah. I'd just like to echo that because, I chaired the IRB at my institution for 10 years as well. I'm no longer on it now, and it has a slightly different structure. But what I saw even when I was on it, and we had various other people who, went through different roles, is that sometimes people are really good at sticking to, this is what we're supposed to be doing, and I'm not going to overreach. And then there are other people where it's very clear that they see it as an opportunity to do things. And ideally, you don't put those people on, but I think that sometimes administrators are motivated to put those people on.
That goes back to something that, and a question that I have for you, and it goes back to what Lee was saying too, as far as like the ethics are the ethics of the individuals. So the question is, how does the IRB ensure that they're not ideologically captured? I mean, it's going back to this idea of who judges the IRB. I mean, it seems like.
No, Jennifer, it's the wrong question. Academia is ideologically captured. It is impossible for there to not be an IRB with faculty dominating its membership that's ideologically captured. It's not literally impossible. You could be at Hillsdale College, I suppose, one of the last bastions of a sort of conservative-leaning academic institution. But by and large, it's all but impossible.
So
Go ahead.
well, I was going to say,
Catherine was right in that no matter how ideologically captured it is, people may vary in how much restraint they're willing to exercise. And even if, they're all Marxists, if they're willing to engage in the restraint that, in my view, would be appropriate for an IRB, then it's not going to matter that they're all Marxists.
And so, again, trying to understand the structure of an IRB, this goes back to Elizabeth. I think you were saying that there has to be a scientist and a non-scientist on the board, and Pam, you were explaining your role kind of in this as well. I mean, is there who chooses who's on the board? Is there any oversight there? Is that could that help with the power dynamics? And also, I mean, I'm wondering with a scientist and a non-scientist, if you're doing a highly scientific study, do you have to have a scientist who understands your study to be on the board? Can they make judgments?
You do not. No, you do not. There are some rules, like, you have to have a prisoner advocate if you're doing research on prisoners. So there are exceptions, but basically, no, you do not have to have a specific, you don't have, if you're doing social science, you don't, like, that's what Catherine was saying. You don't have to have a social scientist on the board. And so you could have somebody who doesn't know anything about social science, reviewing a survey study and thinking that it's not appropriate. So scientists and non-scientists, and then who decides? I mean, and Catherine knows too, it's like, sometimes you put out a call for members and you don't get any new members. That happens too. There's not enough, people are overburdened at universities. They've pushed a lot of administrative work down, onto faculty, and there's a lot of committees out there. So I don't know, did you ever have trouble filling seats?
When I was on it, we didn't have trouble filling seats, but we also had probably less oversight from the administration at that point. So the IRB at my institution was only created a few years before I got there. And the chair then was another psychologist. And we were doing it so that we were compliant for funding and for people's research. But At that point in time, everybody who was on the board was sort of recruited or appointed, and it was consultation between the chair and the provost in terms of picking people based on sort of a sense of, is this person sane and sensible? Is this person going to, do the training they need to do and not, again, have any particular agenda that they're trying to follow? And that worked really well for a long time. And then we had a different provost, and she clearly wanted to change some things. And it was the time I was stepping down. And since then, there's definitely been a sense that some of the people who are on it don't really know what they're doing, including perhaps even the chair. But because they miss things that they shouldn't miss and then call out things that aren't actually a problem because the study's anonymous and they're worried about, whatever. And it's but there's, so there's definitely some weird stuff that goes on. But at this point, it's now just strictly the provost picking everything.
So one of the things that we did was we created, when I was, same thing, I took over from it was only maybe 5 or so years old when I took over. And we actually actively recruited 2 people from each school. Mm-hmm. I shouldn't say actively recruit. We put out calls where we said we particularly needs people from the School of Business. So we were actually, the school, from science, from social science, from the School of Education, from School of Social Work, so that we could get a variety of opinions. But there's no rule that you have to do that. We made that as a policy so that we could try to get more diverse backgrounds onto the board. But as you point out, there's no rule that says you have to do that. And the provost can, put their thumb on the scales, if you're not, and you have to be willing to resign en masse, in order to make a point, which, by the way, we made a point, but it didn't matter.
Yeah.
Well, in your case, Elizabeth, to clarify there, it didn't matter. What I heard you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, is they just went to an outside IRB board. But okay, so could that be a solution though? If IRBs are ideologically captured within academia in general, in the main, is perhaps setting up IRBs outside of academia a solution?
Okay, here's the solution.
Okay.
Or a solution. There are probably many solutions, but here's one solution. Affiliate yourself with a non-academic research outfit that is not required to get IRB approval for anything because they're a freestanding research outfit. Let them do all the data collection, and then you get brought on after the fact. So you're no longer interacting with human subjects. The IRB has no say over that involvement. They would agree. I've asked, at least my IRB admits it has no say over that. It has no role in that. So that is the end around. I don't overstate that. The Rutgers IRB is a mixed bag. They're not ideologically. I've no issue. I've seen no evidence that political work or work on politicized topics that runs counter to prevailing views in academia has any more difficulty passing the Rutgers IRB than anything else. I do that kind of work all the time, and I don't run into inordinate trouble with that. When we have run into trouble, it's not because of the ideological stuff. It's because the bureaucracy is actually insane. So that's a longer story. I'm happy to talk about it, but I'm going to stop there.
No, well, actually, could you give? I'm now you piqued my interest, and I'm curious. Can you give a little more clarity on that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, this is part of the story on that the Unsafe Science post that you introduced us with. Nate Honeycutt, my former graduate student, he's now a research scientist at FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. We're doing all sorts of political psychology studies, and we routinely ask questions from the left-wing authoritarianism scale and the right-wing authoritarianism scale. And occasionally we ask questions about varieties of prejudice and people's belief in sort of very derogatory beliefs about various and sundry groups. Okay, so at some point, some participant complains to our IRB that we were asking, quote, biased questions. Okay, now, if you've ever seen the left-wing or right-wing authoritarianism scale, they are filled with biased questions. That's the entire point. How much do you believe, that we need a mighty leader to crush the perversions that are corrupting our society, right? And that's sort of doing that from memory, but something like that on the right-wing authoritarian. Anyway, so someone contacts complaining that these questions are biased. Okay, here in my alternative world, I'll describe the real world in a minute. In my alternative world, the IRB would have looked at this and said, okay, that's what academic freedom is. You're allowed to ask pretty much any question you want. So we have basically been accused of the metaphorical equivalent of driving 55 miles an hour in a 55 mile an hour zone, and this would be laughed out of court. But that's not what happened. And the reason it's not what happened is not because the IRB is woke or out to get us. It's because this, and I don't know how widespread this rule is. This is the Rutgers policy. Anytime the IRB receives a complaint from a participant, it triggers an extended investigation. No matter what the complaint, the complaint could be, as far as I can tell, the complaint could be that they saw the researchers wearing bunny ears. I mean, that would be a complaint. Would that be dismissed? If it was a complaint, I don't see how it would be dismissed, because the rule is anytime there's a complaint, there has to be a full investigation. Now, and a full investigation is we're like hours of meetings. So at Rutgers, the IRB doesn't even do the investigation. They enlist like some outside auditor, completely independent. They have some relationship with these auditors who comes in to evaluate whether we did anything inappropriate in our study. So she's clueless. She wasn't part of the original. So what do we have to give all the materials, like the research materials, all the data, all correspondence with all participants. So, people periodically contact and say, the study was really interesting. Could you tell me more about it, or send me the paper? It's so we have to track all these down, compile them, give them to the auditor, meet with the auditor, discuss. This went on for hours and hours. We described, I think it was like 3,000 pages of documentation and God knows how many hundreds of hours of work. And we were clear. Of course, we were cleared because we were accused of driving 55 in a 55 mile an hour zone, which was knowable before the entire investigation. But that's what I mean by the bureaucracy is insane. Because the rule, right, and they have to apply the rule even-handedly. They can't make an exception for us or for anybody. So if the rule is participant complains, full investigation, then no matter how ridiculous the complaint is, full investigation. And that is why the bureaucracy is insane.
Okay, I've never heard of such a thing. I've never heard of anything like that before. So, I mean, we did have, you must, to get federal-wide assurance, you must have a process to document, any number of things, right? You have to have a process to do that. But I think that process is a little, it's a little insane. Also, I don't know. I mean, I've never, But that's the first I've heard of anything quite.
That's the thing, though. So much of it is up to the local, right, how they define, these different things, right? So we at our university had a complaint that was after I was already off the board. It was a legitimate complaint. The way that the survey had been delivered to the students was one of those situations where it implied that they needed to complete it Otherwise, it was going to interfere with their registration. And it was like, that's not okay. Like that was not approved when you sent your stuff through. You weren't supposed to be bundling it with stuff. Like it was really problematic. And that case is actually, it was investigated, not in quite such an overhanded way, but they talked to the students. They got confirmation about how it went out. The student was correct. And then they suspended the protocol. And then the provost had a hissy fit because the provost was a fan of the person who did this.
Oh my God.
And they totally redid the entire IRB to basically cover it up.
Wow.
So, I mean, again, this is the problem. There isn't really a clear, like, sort of structure for how you have to do it. It really is up to the different institution how to constitute it. And that means it's very vulnerable to all sorts of things, whether it's ideological capture, whether it's a personal agenda. I mean, it can also work really well. If you have people on it who are dedicated and actually are doing the right thing, it can function perfectly fine, but it doesn't have to.
Mm-hmm. Well, you said something, you know, Lee, you had mentioned this isn't necessarily ideological capture, it's more bureaucracy. But it seems to me, Catherine, from the piece that you wrote, and, you know, maybe I'm just reading it in one section of time, so it came off this way. But it seems that the IRB has progressively over time become more paternalistic. And so maybe the word is bureaucratic, paternalistic. I don't know if it's ideologically for ideological reasons, but is that a fair assessment?
I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of paternalism in that, right? Like it's the idea that, oh, these poor little students, if you show them a picture of a naked person, they're going to be traumatized. I mean, you know, it's like, no, they're not going to be. But I think there is some of that. And some of it is, I think, paternalistic. And some of it is people who have their own, like they have their own baggage, and their own baggage, they want to protect other people from their baggage. So I think some of it can be that. I do think, I mean, I certainly wrote about cases where it definitely was ideologically driven, but those were also specific cases, right? You know, in terms of, you know, like
well,
research.
ours clearly was ideological.
Yeah.
I mean, it was clearly, you know, I mean, it was a statement that half of the country would have agreed with, but it was the half of the country. In fact, we were told, why didn't you study QAnon? And I said, well, that's, you know, that's actually not a bad idea. And it might be something that we would do if we could. We can't do research anymore, but if we could, we might have. But I said, you realize that we would have made people mad if we asked about QAnon too. And they're like, oh, that's okay. We don't care if you make them mad. I mean, they actually admitted that, like, it's okay to make that half of the country mad. It's not okay to make the other half of the country mad. One of the things I worry about, you know, is that people like students, for example, like you mentioned, are, because they know that they're on a short leash, their short time frame, that they may, and these are, you know, new researchers with supposedly new ideas, right? And new applications of old ideas and stuff, that they might actually hesitate to put something through that would be, you know, a thinking outside the box thing, or, you know, even something that would, you know, potentially, you know, cause someone some discomfort for, like, you know, half a second. And that we may be like sort of narrowing the kind of research that that gets done. I don't know.
I think it's a legitimate concern for sure.
Absolutely. Particularly if this is being drawn out. I mean, just in your case, Lee, you said it was what, 6 months and 3,000 papers. So if you're a graduate student doing this research, you don't have the time.
Yeah. I mean, Nate was a grad student at the time, and it might have shut down his dissertation research. In the actual event, it just delayed it. So it was like annoying, or somewhat worse than annoying, but not terrible.
Right.
But so, yeah. Yeah, I mean, especially when you throw it in the mix with the ideological capture of academia writ large. Imagine you're a grad student and you really just want to understand stuff. And you're not committed to, you may have personal political beliefs, but you're not committed to the science finding something that vindicates the left or the right. Why would you risk conducting something that's going to piss off progressives? Because one, they may be dominating the IRB and the thing will never get through, or they'll put you through hell to get through it. Or even if you get through the IRB, how the hell are you going to publish it? Like, you probably can. I mean, I've published stuff like that my entire career, but that's not what a grad student is likely to think. They're like, why should I sail into headwinds when I could sail with the breeze in my back?
And I think that's, yeah, Elizabeth, that's what you're saying. We're getting narrower in the scope of research just because of to try to stave off those headwinds.
Yeah, and let's be clear, like maybe Lee's graduate students can publish things, right? But Roland Fryer's students can, and whatever, but Elizabeth Spivak's students can't, right? Mm-hmm. So look, I mean, I'm at a regional state institution. I'm not a star, right? And for me to get students into PhD programs from this state school that most people haven't heard from is a big deal. And we have to be very careful. So I don't have Rutgers behind me. I'm not Lee Jussim. I'm a complete unknown, right? And so I think there's more of me than there are Lee Jussims. And so, yeah, I think that I think it matters a lot, I guess, and a lot more than we can measure.
That brings me, I've got two more questions, and I want to remind the audience, if you type your questions into Twitter or to YouTube, we'll get them here and we'll start to take audience questions shortly. But okay, now I lost my train of thought on one question, but I do have another question here. We're talking about harm. So what is, and it might be something that's evolving over time. And maybe, again, Elizabeth, with you, with this kind of ideological capture, if that's indeed what's happening with some IRBs, that definition of harm has been changing. But is there a standard of harm, a definition that we're working with that IRBs kind of have, across the board? And what does it mean? What does do no harm mean?
Well, Catherine can probably weigh in on this too, but I mean, it is all relative, right? Because if look, I mean, people take experimental chemotherapy drugs, right? And that is clearly harmful, okay? But they believe, there's a belief that participating in an experimental drug trial, that there's a payoff, that there's enough reward, if not for you as the cancer patient, but for future cancer patients. So that's, I mean, everything is relative. Now, if I mean, we can, go from medical and chemotherapy to, other kinds of recreational, drugs. We could, do marijuana and alcohol and that kind of stuff, which researchers have a really hard time, doing. Very few researchers, which is a problem, right? When not enough research labs can get that kind of approval to do, drugs or, do research on mushrooms and that kind of thing. But then there's, the sort of like, do you consider harm, using researchers or using participants' time, maybe for a long form interview, a couple of hours, where they schedule an interview and maybe they travel to the interview site maybe more than one time and that kind of stuff. So they're investing time, energy, money, and that kind of thing for a study that's so poorly designed, or that data is collected in a manner that is, or going to be analyzed in a manner that's not productive. It's like, well, who was harmed? Well, the participants who invested 6 hours of their time and travel and maybe poured their heart out, maybe, shared, personal stories or whatever, and the research couldn't go anywhere. I mean, these are two very extreme examples, and you might think, well, one is obvious and the other one's silly. But we did certainly sometimes consider that. Like if a research study was so poorly designed that you couldn't possibly determine anything from it. Or we had an example where somebody wanted to use an app that first of all cost money, and second of all had a do not disseminate. It's like, you can't use this app for research purposes unless you contact us. And it was a teacher who wanted their students to download the app and use it as part of of classroom activities. Now, we could have just said that's exempt and let them go, but it was illegal use of the app, right? So is that a risk? Is that a risk to her school, to the researcher? It's not a risk to the human subjects, right? Because they're downloading the app, right? Maybe even with their parents' approval or whatever. They're just using the Calm app or whatever. They're like listening to rain. That's not harmful. But is it harmful to the researcher, to the school where she teaches, to our school where she's attending school? So, it's complicated. I mean, what do you think, Catherine?
Well, I mean, a lot of the kinds of things that I think about normally when I think about harm that I think of as being truly harmful are the things that we just don't do at my school, right? So I'm at a small private school. We don't have a medical school, so nobody's giving anybody any drugs or things like that. I think, the majority of the work that we have going on is the traditional social psych research, or it's educational research, somebody wanting to do interviews, whatever. And again, you will see people suggest sometimes that things are going to be harmful, but it is usually people who find things harmful either for ideological reasons or for uptightness about sex reasons. Those are the ones that I've seen most commonly. Somebody who thinks, well, you shouldn't ask people about that because it's icky, right? And it's just like, well, that's very subjective, okay? And that was kind of the whole point of one of those studies. We had one person on the committee who was not really happy with the fact that we did a study asking people to evaluate whether they thought particular activities were degrading or not. They clearly thought everything was degrading. But the whole point of the study was it actually mattered who was doing what to whom, whether people actually thought it was degrading. But it was their own personal. So whether it's ideological or it's other things, people sometimes let their own personal ideas about those, these topics influence whether they think there's harm to other people of engaging in it. And I don't even and again, it's like there's no objective measure of that harm in most cases.
Pam, you had mentioned, I want to go back to you because you had mentioned, you took your role very seriously in, evaluating harm. Do you have a specific idea what that was in your mind? Did you have a definition of harm?
Well, I didn't have a hard line like, oh, this is harm that I can handle or not. I mean, I really did think, I just thought about it as, if I were a participant, how would I feel? Right. And, a lot of it was such a low level of harm. Like, oh, you might be embarrassed by this question, but I didn't I wouldn't shut down a study over that. I would say, you should put in the introductory letter, that it's informed, right? They're giving informed consent, and they do need to be informed. Like this, you'll see pictures of naked people, and if that's something that you can't, that you feel will be harmful for you for whatever reason, then this is not the study for you, right? And they're told up front. But if somebody says, sure, I want to look at pictures of naked people, click right on through, so for me, it was really just, did you take the least amount of effort to let people know what they might be subjected to, right? And, I wanted to add too about Elizabeth's point about time, so we have a small body of participants at our school of people who can, who will be part of this, who might be part of a study. And so if they, there's a requirement for certain classes that you have to participate in a study, right? So we've got this pool of applicants, and people who, there's not people who are just going to go, oh, can I be in a study? I want to be in a study. Where could I be in a study, right? It's going to be people who are required to do it. So we've got this kind of limited pool of people. And so if we have people participating in studies that are not going to yield any good results, there's a greater harm. It's not necessarily to the participant, except that maybe they've wasted their time, but there's a harm to the other researchers who now have lost that potential participant in their study that might have actually yielded something.
Yeah, and to be clear, that didn't happen very often, but it did occasionally happen. And I think that what Catherine and Lee keep coming back to is just a reminder that, a research study is the safest place to learn about the ugliness of human behavior. And so if IRBs are preventing us from studying, prejudice, whether it's misogyny or, whether it's rape, like date rape beliefs, whatever it is, even if anti-Black Lives Matter beliefs, right? Like where should we find out about racism, sexism, that kind? Where should we find out? We should find out about it in a research study, not out in the wild, right? Where we can actually be harmed. We should be in the safety of a research study. This just like you would when you're studying drugs, right? You shouldn't be studying the effects of drugs out on the street. You should be studying it under the, hopefully the, care of a medical professional. And so I do think also that IRBs sometimes forget that. They forget that that's what research is about, maybe pushing the limits in order to learn about human behavior more broadly, and how, especially in the case of social science, how we might intervene, to be helpful, to be useful, to contribute to our knowledge of humans, of ourselves. We're the only, we're studying ourselves, for heaven's sakes. If we can't do that in the auspices of a lab, then unfortunately, we're going to find out a lot harder way.
Yeah, if you're researching issues that are harmful, rape, et cetera, and you can't do the research, then it makes it a little bit difficult to actually solve the problem. I think that is a good place to end us up. Any last words, yay or nay, on IRBs? Lee, what do you say?
I would definitely like to take a wrecking crew to most of the IRB and leave a skeleton crew. I mean, there needs to be something there. And do I really believe this? Look, to some extent, the IRBs are responding to federal and state rules and regulations, and those are inordinately Byzantine and complicated. But I would take a wrecking crew to most of that also, if I could.
Okay. Anyway, I like your idea, Lee, what you had mentioned earlier in the conversation of kind of outsourcing the IRB as a possible solution. Anyone else with possible solutions or yays or nays on IRBs?
Well, of course, there are external IRBs. It costs money, and they become entities in and of themselves. They become businesses, right? And so I think that I don't think that would solve the problem, because as they become more professionalized and institutional, they become institutions themselves, and then maybe they would be advertising themselves as, certain kinds of IRB. I mean, they would,
Right.
they become another retail shop.
Yeah, more bureaucracy. It's just, then that's not helpful either.
Right. So, Catherine, what would you, if you could wave your magic wand, what would you do to change the IRB structure?
Oh, that's a tough question. To me, I actually think the way ours was when I was first on it was actually not bad, because we didn't actually have a lot of ideological capture on that particular collection of people. But that's difficult because that requires a provost who cares about that. And I think that there are very few provosts who actually care about that at all. And so, to me, it's a necessary evil. I have to send my stuff to an IRB. I publish in journals that require that. For me, this is not going to go away. I do think that we could do better. But I think that we would actually need better administrators to do better.
Pam, final thoughts?
Just this conversation's making me think about like the issue with me, like getting a comment from a reviewer saying, did this get IRB approval? And then, Lee's experience with, anybody who complains like, oh, the survey took too long. Okay, now we're going to open up a full investigation, right? Because it's the same problem I have with like zero tolerance policies. Like, oh, well, let's just have one rule for everything and then we don't have to think about it. And I think it even goes back to why people don't want to be on IRBs. Like they're afraid that they're going to do it wrong, right? Oh, I might make a mistake. So, so either, question everything or approve everything, but I don't want to be the one to make a decision. And I think it's a much bigger problem in academia. I mean, I see it a lot with people just, it's not just that we have a lot of demands on our time and we don't want to be on the committee. It's like, well, what if I make the wrong decision on the committee? I don't want to be the one. I don't want to be the one. And I think it's a much bigger problem. It's just that it's manifesting so hugely in IRBs.
It's a much larger societal problem at that point, right? Nobody really wants to have to deal with that responsibility.
Right, all around.
We live in fear much more than we used to, for sure.
We were supposed to leave on a good note, Elizabeth.
I do think that there are good IRB members, there are good IRBs, and I think that there are schools and hospitals where they are working together. Unfortunately, that's maybe not as universal as we'd like. I don't think the right thing to do is to get rid of, IRBs. Obviously, as Lee said, we know what life is like without this kind of review, and it's pretty scary. So, there's improvements to be made, and we've all told, stories here today that described IRBs gone awry. But I hope that the majority of them are not quite so bad.
Allow me to give a metaphor. When I first moved to New Jersey in 1987, you had to get your car inspected every year. It was just the rule. And it was horrendous. The lines went on for like a quarter of a mile. It would be like most of a day to get your stupid car inspected. And I think it was Christy Whitman comes in, Republican bureaucracy, red tape cutter, which sometimes does more harm than good. But in this particular case, well, they just changed the rules. The rules were, if you had a new car, you didn't need to get it inspected for 4 years. It's a new car. Like there's nothing going to go wrong for the first 3 years. So all the new cars are now out of the system, and everybody else, it was every other year. It was every other year. So it immediately reduced the torture of getting your car inspected by 60 to 70%. It is no longer torture. It's you go in, there's a couple of cars in front of you. The whole thing takes maybe 45 minutes or an hour, and you only have to do it every other year. And if you have a new car, you don't have to do it for 4 years. It's right. Okay. I could imagine that applied to the IRB. I absolutely could imagine it.
You can imagine it.
I can, yes, totally. Yeah, get rid of all the nonsense. I mean, look, the Rutgers application is also insane. I was twice suspended from working on particular projects, not from working on any particular projects. One was because I exceeded the sample size. So what? This is not your problem. You approved the study, so we did it with more people than we originally said, okay? Where is the harm? Who is being harmed? Who are you protecting? Nobody. It was like the bureaucratic red tape of the IRB was violated. That was number one. And the second time was, I don't know, about 4 or 5 years ago, the IRB started requiring final reports on projects. Well, I never had to do that. For 30 years, I never do final reports. And I did not get the memo. So I didn't do these final reports. And they told me, I got these nasty emails. I mean, they weren't nasty. They were very professional, but I experienced them as nasty because basically what they said is you can't work on this project till you write up this final report. And I'm like, who is being protected by the final report? It's just the IRB. This is like a bureaucratic convenience for the IRB. There is no human who is more or less harmed whether I do a final report. It's completely insane. So it's that kind of nonsense that, just like with the car inspection, could be completely cut out from the IRB stuff. Completely cut out.
And they tried to do that when they rewrote the common rule, again, with exempt study. They expanded the exemption, hugely expanded the exemption, and it didn't do any good. And those kinds of things, like, I don't know, Catherine, we never required a final report, right? We never did that.
I didn't when I was doing it, but they do now.
Yeah. So, this is, who knows who's pushing for that? It's not in the federal guidelines. The federal guidelines do not require a final report. The federal guidelines do not require you to, if you go over 3 participants or even 300 participants in a survey study, because that's exempt, so it doesn't matter. Obviously in medical protocols, it could matter, right? You give too many people the chemotherapy drug. But I also have to say that, I doubt if this is a problem at Rutgers, because we have higher level, better trained researchers and that kind of thing. But, there was a fair number of people who were applying to IRB at my institution who genuinely wanted and needed help making their study better. That's one of the reasons they applied, was because they wanted a committee to actually help them out. And so, they hadn't done research. They were doing research maybe with students or whatever, and they needed help. They didn't want to tell, this is part and parcel of the whole thing. They didn't want to tell their student that the research study sucked. So they wanted the IRB to tell the student that the research study sucked. So from this standpoint, now that is faculty members using the bureaucracy so that they had an out. So they didn't hurt someone's feelings. They didn't want to hurt the student's feelings, because the student would complain and then administration would be mad at them. So there's plenty of blame to go around here. And I agree, it seems like I think your Rutgers IRB, they need to take a step back.
Maybe you can share this live stream with them.
They need to chill.
So to some extent, it's like functioning under, it's not quite as anywhere near as extreme, but it's sort of like functioning under late stage communism. So the current requirements on this are that you can't exceed your proposed participant limit. So for a while, for about 2 years, this worked. We would put in the proposals, we were going to collect at least X number of things, at least 1,000 people. So now it's like, okay. So no matter what number, if we're under, we're good. If we're over, we're good, is completely uninformative. They eventually ceased accepting that. So, usually when we do a study, we have an idea. But, we may decide we have more resources, we can collect more people. Maybe we're conducting an experiment via a survey, and it's less expensive than we anticipated. So rather than collect 800, we're going to collect 1,200. So just to ensure, or maybe we're going to try and replicate it, right? So now it's going to be 2,400. So why should we just make up numbers? 8,000. So it's going to be 8,000. 15,000 people. And it's just completely meaningless. So we are now entering completely meaningless numbers because those will be acceptable to the IRB and not prevent us from conducting the research. It's just absurd. It's like completely absurd. Workers of the world unite.
The harm of do no harm.
Yeah, that's what we should have named this. The harm of do no harm. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all. Thank you so much for joining us. Of course, Elizabeth and Pam, always appreciate you. And Catherine and Lee, thank you for joining our discussion this evening. And to improved IRBs.
Yeah.
It may be.
We raise a glass. Yeah.
Cheers. Oh, you've got your cognac in the back there.
I do have my cognac. I'm not sure I have anything to drink it with. I don't think like swigging the cognac would be appropriate, so I won't be doing that.
All right, everyone. Have a good evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.